and he's going to talk to us about the Gallipoli campaign, a lost opportunity of the Great War. And he's done quite a bit of research on this, so we're all very enthusiastic about hearing this now.
It's going to be age to seat stuff, Karen.
Absolutely, absolutely. As you can probably see, JJ is recording, but the focus is going to be completely on Padraig, so the rest of us can relax. All right?
No. I try to get him to pan around every now and then.
No, you're grand.
No panic,
No panic. As you're all probably aware, transport had a major role to play in the First World War. Just prior to it, this was the home depot of the Royal Munster Fusiliers, their reserve battalion, and a lot of local men were reservists with that battalion. But very quickly after the start of the First World War, from about September 1914, the Connacht Rangers actually came in here into Charlesfort, also into Kinsale military barracks. And in addition to that, they built about 80 wooden huts up where all the football pitches are now today. So there was quite a lot of men associated with this area, with Ireland, and some recruits from England as well who were stationed and trained here during the First World War. So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about, sadly, what happened to some of them throughout the war. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to pass you right over to Mr. Padraig Walsh.
Thank you very much. Let's go. So the title is The Gallipoli Campaign, The Lost Opportunity of the Great War. So what we're going to look at is really, was it a lost opportunity? So the drama of the Dardanelles campaign, by reason of the beauty of its setting, the grandeur of its team and the unhappiness of its ending, will always rank amongst the world's classic tragedies. The story is a record of lost opportunities and eventual failure. That's part of the official war diaries. Now, my interest in Gallipoli started when I was a child. About that height. Lovely little youngster I was.
With hair.
So my great-grandfather was John Sullivan there. And that's the first I have ever heard of Gallipoli, was when I would go up to visit my grandparents up in Mount Nebo Avenue. This photograph of John Sullivan was up on the wall, up behind the television. And there was his medals were in underneath. It was like a little shrine really to him, you know. So the large medal that all those that died in the First World War got, called the penny, the blood penny it was called, and all his other medals were there. And all we would ever be told was that he went out to the Dardanelles and he was killed by the Turks, that they were waiting up in the hills, waiting up on the cliffs and that. And wasn't that an awful thing to do? So this photograph was there, and that's all that we were ever told really. But that photograph and the photograph was a sight that was fine photograph, good size photograph. But when we tried to take it out, actually it just stuck to the glass, so it's remained in the glass and in the frame forevermore. So that's all we ever know. So that's what my first interest in it was. No, oh my God. All right, So the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey is an area of about 40 miles in length and about 12 miles wide. It's largely barren with a tangle of deep gullies and ridges and little vegetation. The Dardanelles is the waterway which runs along its southern shore. Now you can see it there, and a photograph there of what the terrain looks like. That's not it. There we go. So it's really all these little hills and gullies and that, and it was torturous really to try and get over it, to get across it and all that sort of thing. So it was a real rough terrain really that they were fighting in. So, at the outbreak of the Great War in August 1914, Turkey was all that was left really of the Ottoman Empire. It was in a poor state and had lost lots of its territory in a series of disastrous wars, really. It was corrupt, it was financially broke, and on the verge of collapse. And you can see there from that map there, so the dark coloured is where remains of the empire. The rest of there had all been sliced off in various years, 1882, 1912, Algeria, Bosnia, it was all part of the Ottoman Empire, and they were all kind of chopped off, really. So the Ottoman Empire was kind of really in decline, and so there was a revolution there in 1908, and some radical army officers took over control of the country, but they kept the Sultan more like a figurehead than anything else. And it's aimed to modernise the country and rebuild the strength of, say, the last empire. That's what happened there. So part of this rebuilding that they wanted to do was what they wanted to rebuild their navy. So they went to Britain to build 2 ships for them, 2 ships. And that was gone through, and really the money for it was collected up locally because they didn't have any money. So there was a lot of encouragement by the local people in getting these ships, right? So Winston Churchill, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he instructed the dockyard because he knew that there was a war on the way, and he didn't want those ships to go to Turkey. So he got them to delay any kind of, if they were close to being finished, so he got them to delay it and hang on like that. And up to the very end then, and when war was declared, Winston Churchill then immediately confiscated the 2 ships and he took them from. So Turkey never got the 2 ships, right? So that upset, obviously, Turkey very much. So following on from this, Germany, cute enough, they stepped in to Turkey and they said to them, we'll provide you the 2 ships, you side with us, and we'll look after you. So they also made promises that they would help recover some of the lost Turkish territories and guaranteed our current borders would remain. Germany therefore convinced the Turks that it was in their best interest to side with them in this war. And that's what they did. So General Lehman von Sanders was the leader of a German military mission in Turkey. Germany and Turkey shared a common enemy, Russia. And the Dardanelles was Russia's lifeline to the sea. So on September the 26th, Turkey, with German encouragement, closed off the Dardanelles. And mines were laid across the channel. The lighthouses were extinguished and notices put up on the cliffs warning all vessels that passage was blocked. Von Sanders was now in control. So they shut off the waterway. This upset, this was a vital waterway for Russia, but also they needed arms, but also the Russian grain was stopped up immediately, and Britain actually imported something like 85% of their grain. So it's very important that they keep this waterway open. You can see that there now. So with the appearance of the German ships, a British naval mission in Turkey withdrew, and by October, German ships given to Turkey sailed into the Black Sea and attacked Russian ports. And that's a photograph from there, the triggering Russia to declare war on Turkey, and Britain and France followed suit. So they were slated there. Meanwhile, say 4 months into the beginning of the hostilities of the war on the Western Front, it had come to a standstill. So both sides were stuck in trenches all around the country, and there was horrendous loss of life. Now, Churchill, of course, had always his sights on Turkey from confiscating those ships and that, but he was very anxious that the Navy would get more involved in the First World War, and he thought just like protecting the trade routes wasn't enough. So he was horrified, of course, by the reports of the bloodbath, trench warfare, and he felt the passive role being played by the Navy was a wasted resource. And he wanted the Navy to play a more proactive and central role in the war, not just protecting the trade routes, as I say. So, in January 1915, an appeal came from Russia for assistance. They were fighting Turkey in the Caucasus Mountains, and they just wanted really a more display of support than anything else. But the response from Kitchener was that all the troops were engaged in the Western Front. None of them were to be sent anywhere else. The only assistance possible would be a gesture of support by the Navy at the Dardanelles. So that's what. This is when Churchill came up with a plan to break the deadlock on the Western Front by attacking Germany at its weakest point, namely Turkey. So he thought he could attack Germany by knocking Turkey out of the war and attacking England then instead via the back door, or Germany by the back door. The Navy would attack the forts and the guns, and also the Turks, they would stand up like a big pipe, like a sewer pipe, and they'd have a little fire underneath it, and from the sea and looking in, they think that's one of the cannons there, and it was just sewer pipe, so they tricked it that way as well, like that. In any event, these older ships, believe it or not, at best had just something like a 3% chance of actually hitting any targets. The fishing trawlers were fitted out as minesweepers, and when they were brought forward, they were constantly under fire, and they were too slow and an easy target. So attempts to clear the minefields at night and under the cover of darkness, however, they found themselves illuminated with searchlights and were again fired upon. The civilian crews understandably lost their nerve and they retreated. So even the Queen Elizabeth, the most modern battleship in the world with its 15-inch guns, proved ineffective against the Turkish forts. You see them there? Churchill was increasingly impatient at the lack of progress, and he put pressure on Carden to get on with it. Against his better judgment, Carden decided that he would send in all the fleet on March the 17th, and by sheer weight of numbers, pound the forts out of existence, which would allow him the ability to clear the minefields. So that was the plan. However, 2 days before the attack, Carden collapsed from exhaustion and anxiety and was invalided home. Vice Admiral de Robeck succeeded him and assured Churchill that he would carry out Carden's plan. The great attack would now go ahead on March the 18th. In a tremendous spectacle of naval might, 18 battleships and an armada of destroyers and cruisers squeezed themselves into the mouth of the Dardanelles. A bombardment of the forts began and intensified in one line of ships after another, came within range and opened fire. The forts did remain silent and fire was returned. 2 ships were severely damaged and had to be withdrawn. Others, while damaged, were able to continue. Then a French ship, the Bouvet, hit a mine and quickly sank, taking most of its crew with it. The minesweepers were brought forward and ran into a rain of shells, dropping from mobile howitzers, which the ships could not locate. The minesweepers fled in disorder. Another ship struck a mine, and when more ships damaged the Roebuck, called off the attack. The March the 18th failure was the final attempt made by the Navy to force a way through the Dardanelles. Now the Turks, the Bouvet that hit the minefield, the Turks had noted that the ships were turning around in this wide area of the Dardanelles, and which there was no mines there. So on the night before it, a ship came out and stretched a couple of mines along there, and that's when that Bouvet hit there. But the Allies thought that the Turks were actually floating mines down in the channel, and they got a fright that way, right? So that's when the Bouvet was turning and it struck the mine and it sank. In a little over 2 minutes, and it taking its crew of over 500 men with them. One of the questions that would dog the history of the campaign to this day is the belief that the Turks had run out of ammunition following the attack of the 18th, and so a renewed effort on the following day would have succeeded. But recent research of Turkish records do not support this theory, and they certainly had enough to repel another attack. For all their efforts, only 1 heavy gun had been destroyed and 4 temporarily out of action, while a third of the Roebuck squadron was at the bottom of the sea or facing extensive repairs. The key to the entire defensive system of the Dardanelles was the minefields and the guns protecting it. Overall, 17 attempts were made to sweep the mines, and only on 2 occasions did they actually reach the minefield. Mines and guns overlooking them were the main barrier to the fleet's progress, and they remained intact. Certainly another attempt would also fail. The Navy planners had a false impression of the ease at which the operation would be brought to a successful conclusion. At the range at which the ships were firing, they had a 2 to 3% chance of actually hitting any target. But there was no going back. What started as a naval-only campaign with the provision that if unsuccessful, they could withdraw. No, when it did fail, they seemed determined not to withdraw, but send in an army. Not alone did the Dardanelles provide a supply route for arms-starved Russia, but a supply route out of Russia for its grain. And when the Dardanelles was closed off, immediately Russian ships loaded up with wheat began to pile up. Britain imported 85% of its wheat. Without the Russian wheat, price was going to skyrocket. So there was a lot of reasons why they wanted to support Russia, but they also wanted the grain as well. They needed that. feed the army and to feed the people. So despite all the talk that the troops would not be available, that they were all needed for the Western Front, Kitchener announced the 29th Division would join the French, Australian and New Zealand troops being assembled in Egypt to form a Mediterranean expeditionary force. To help the Navy get through the Dardanelles, the date set of April the 25th was set for the landings to begin. So they were to land. The invasion force gathered in Madras Harbour on the island of Lemnos, and Sir Ian Hamilton was made Commander-in-Chief. He was one of Britain's most experienced generals. However, he knew little of the Dardanelles, the Turkish army, or of modern warfare. He now had something like 80,000 troops at his disposal. So they wanted a swift campaign. Troops would land on the southern tip of Gallipoli Peninsula with the immediate objective of capturing the village of Prithia and the high ground dominating it, known as Achibaba. The Anzacs would land further up north, would seize the dominant high ground and exploit their landings by marching directly across open country to the coast of Medos, barely 5 miles distant, and cut off any Turkish reinforcements heading south. However, the landings were very badly mismanaged. I'll show you that in a sec. So the Gallipoli Peninsula, showing where the landings would take place there. You see down at the very tip of the peninsula there, you'll see a number of beaches, Y Beach, B Beach, and others. And then further up there, you'll see where Anzac Cove is there, further up the coast, about 4 miles up along. And you can see from that map the furthest part that the fleet actually got in as far as nowhere near the Narrows, which is where all heavy guns were. So that's the situation that they were there. So the Anzacs were first. These are the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps Anzacs, and they were the first to set off and land. So they set off at 2 a.m. on board the battleships, and they set off for the coast. Now, they set off at the dark, pretty disappointed in that they actually landed at the wrong beach. So there they are, they've been lit off, so that the soldiers would be in these boats there, the smaller boats, they're all tied together and they're pulled on. And then they would row the last bit into shore themselves. So the Anzacs landed a mile north of where they were intended to, and they landed on the most savage part of the whole peninsula, which was a wasteland really. And what they had then was, instead of even ground behind them, they had these cliffs right behind them then that they had to climb up and get over. So, like, we always think that they were attacked straight away when they got down onto the beach, but you can see from that photograph there and other photographs later, they were attacked straight away at Anzac, at the end of the cove. You can see them there. So, the narrow beach became very overcrowded and very quickly, and causing the troops to get mixed up and some confusion. At the photo show there, they initially met very little resistance, but that would soon change. See them, some of them there are stretched out and relaxed there in the sunshine. After all, they were in the Mediterranean, lads. And you can see from that photograph there, like the cliffs that were right over them, some of them there. You can see all the horses that they brought in and all of that. So, dreadful terrain that they were facing. Now, some of the Australians that started to climb up over the hills and make progress in that, and there was some bit of fighting. There wasn't many Turks behind them, and there was some fighting went on, some firing went on, and there was a bit of confusion, all right. And amid much confusion, a junior Turkish commander was sent off with a battalion to meet a possible invading force. He was sent off to meet this Anzac force there. Ahead of his troops, he arrived above the Anzac Cove, and he met the Turks running away. They were running away from the Anzacs at this stage. They had run out of ammunition, and there was only a small few of them there. And this man, he ordered them to stop, attach their bayonets, and lay down on the ground. And when the chasing Anzacs troops saw this, they too stopped and did the same. This delay allowed him to bring forward his troops, which were just waiting a short distance. This junior officer was Mustafa Kemal, and he proved himself a better and more aggressive battlefield commander than anyone else in Gallipoli. So he stops the advance of the Anzacs. he saw that holding the hills where they were, that was the most important hills of all, and they would hold the key to the southern half of the peninsula. So he saw this, and he actually sent back then for more, even though he would be qualified and he would be high enough a rank to actually do it, but he got more troops to come up, and that's what they did. So he did stop the Anzacs, all right. So following the initial landing, the ridges were stormed and they were captured back and forth in a seesaw battle for survival for the rest of that day. At the end of the day, however, the Turks still held the high ground. They held the high ground, and that was the secret to it all right. So holding the hills proved the key to commanding the southern half of the peninsula. Meanwhile, down on the southern tip, and where Gallipoli, where the Munsters and the Dublins were to land, there was a number of beaches, and you can see Y Beach, X Beach, W Beach, V Beach, where they were on the fighting did place there. So that's where they were to land there. And you can see there, looking along, is that village there called Critia, and the high ground behind it there called Achibaba. Right? And you can see where Y Beach is there. We'll come into that there in a second. Said you to see stuff, lads. Huh?
I'm following.
So the Munster Dublin Fusiliers were destined to land and be at the very tip of the peninsula. And a converted coal ship, a collier, called the River Clyde, was used as their main transport, with smaller boats in tow, packed with troops. And there she is, ploughing towards the coast there. Into the village of Critia, that you see there, and they found the village was deserted, and they came back again. Now, there was 3 major battles afterwards, May, June, and July, of trying to capture that village there, and they never could. And they could have had it on day one if they hadn't known what they were doing, right? But the man that was in charge of the landings down the south, he was Hunter Weston, and he had very little regard for his troops, and he was known as the butcher of hells. That's something that came out in the end. So,
Well, and Y Beach, were they Irish soldiers again?
no, there were Irish ones, no. Not sure, I think. So just said all that there. They took off their packs, they made some tea, some of them went forward. So that's the actual Y Beach there. So they just climbed up that. There was no one else around than that. So that was very disappointing. All right, that they would do such a thing like that. Make it, waste troops really. So by the end of that, the first day, like the V Beach, there was nothing able to move. The Anzacs were stopped. They were able to move as well. And the Anzacs, they were looking for reinforcements, for ammunition, for military fire, and for someone to take away the wounded. There was no arrangements made whatsoever to look after any of the wounded. So some of the divisional generals were of the opinion that it was best to evacuate to avoid a complete fiasco the following day. So that night they went out to General Ian Hamilton. He was the man, the general in charge, and he had been touring around in the Queen Elizabeth, the battleship all day. He was really out of contact with anything that was going on. So they said to him, this is a disaster. We have to evacuate. So Hamilton asked the Navy, can we get them off? And they said, no, it'll take a couple of days at least to get them off. And so, and just at that time, then a message came through that an Australian submarine had actually made its way in under all the minefields and up into the Sea of Marmara, and they were going to be causing chaos with all the Turkish ships up there after that. So Hamilton said, look, all we have to do is you have to dig in. That's all you have to do. So dig in and hold up. That's what you have to do. So that's what they actually did. So the troops were eventually landed that night from the River Clyde, and the following day then there was close hand fighting to clear away the Turks from the village behind Kinsale and force and that. So they eventually, then they did actually then set up their camp there when they cleared the Turks from there. They set up their camp there, and that's the V Beach there. You can see they set a bar there, and back you can see all the troops that have landed there now. So it became like a little mining town. So these barges there were the horse for bringing the horses in, and they would use them after actually for trying to evacuate the wounded. So they would have been very clean. But this is Hunter Western, right? So he was commanding the British Hells, and he had little regard for his troops. He was soon dubbed the Butcher of Hells. He invariably ordered a frontal attack in daylight against an enemy in a fixed position, ready to repel. He keeps doing the same thing over and over, never changed anything like that. So he launched 3 major battles to capture that one little village that we mentioned earlier there, April, May and July, and each time they were thrown back, lots of men. And you can see them over the edge there. And, so all these attacks were thrown back by an increasingly effective Turkish defence force. So the Anzac troops had to dig in, and trench warfare then began, which is what they were supposed to avoid in the first day, the trench warfare in the Western Front. So having consolidated on May the 2nd, the Anzacs went in offensive and failed with almost over 1,000 casualties in the photographs there. Then on May the 19th, the Turks launched a night attack to push the Anzacs into the sea. As they came roaring out of their trenches, and thousands of them, one after another. And the Australians actually climbed up onto the parapets and firing at them as much as they possibly could. So they were even jostling with each other to get up there to fire all these Turks running towards them there. So it became a bit of a frenzy. And as an attack, of course, it was madness really. So within days, the stench from the rotting corpses was so overwhelming that a truce was agreed to bury the over 4,000 Turks that lay in front of the Anzac trenches. So some troops took advantage of the ceasefire to swim and clean their clothes, which were all infested with lice. Isn't that lovely? They were forced to dig in even the most narrow beachhead to escape the Turkish fire. So they were never really kind of out of range of the Turks. Even if they went down onto the beach to try and have a swim, they would be come under fire there. So the troops faced appalling conditions really. The food consisted of tinned corned beef, tea and biscuits. The biscuits apparently were so hard they would break your teeth. There was a shortage of water, and they faced endless digging in trenches in searing heat. The stench of unburied bodies was overpowering and even carried out to the ships offshore. They could smell it offshore. So there was no proper sanitation. Dysentery was widespread, better known as the Gallipoli troughs. Millions of flies swarmed and bloated and the unburied corpses and onto the men's food. Constant danger of instant death from a sniper's bullet. These were the kind of conditions that there were. So these were the original barges really for carrying the cattle, and they used them then for carrying the injured off. Snipers were a constant threat. Under the Green Party there, in the middle of that there. And you can see there, there's a shell after landing there in the water there. And they were never out of reach really of the Turkish shells really. And it was all about improvising, so they were trying to dig wells, they were trying to make grenades there out of these jam tins and carving tins that they were using there. So the Gallipoli campaign is a failure. The army in the south is bogged down in front of Krithia, who cannot take the village. At Anzac, nothing is moving and nobody is ever going to get over those hills. They are pinned against almost to the cliff edge. So the poor planning, the lack of men, the lack of resources, the shoddy medical facilities, it's all unraveled. Following appeals from Hamilton and in the face of fierce opposition, Kitchener decided to send an additional 25,000 troops to Gallipoli for a fresh offensive in August. Basically, the Anzacs would attack the high ground during the night of August the 6th, and when the troops landed at Sullivan, then they would combine with them to capture the remainder of the Surrey Bay Range, which was the high ground. So timing was vital. So General Sir Frederick Stopford instructions were on landing at Sullivan Bay to surprise and overwhelm any local troops and immediately seize the commanding heights. Above all, it was impressed on him the importance of speed if the military plan was to succeed. Every minute wasted after landing would allow the Turks to move up reserves. Now, the man that they put in charge, Sir Frederick Stafford, he was elderly, totally inexperienced to active corps command. His expertise was ceremonial dress, and he remained on board his sloop and slept through most of the landing. So you can see there that the map we looked at earlier, and the Suvla Bay part is up the northern part there. So that's where they were landing there. You can see Anzac Cove, where the Australian New Zealanders are down there, and then the British are down south. So the Connacht Rangers, which we mentioned earlier, leaving Lemnos, they were part of the Suvla Bay offensive, and you can see them there in their bows there being carried out. Despite the clear urgency to make progress on landing, Stafford seemed to become paralysed by fear of attacking entrenched positions and decided no advance would be made until more artillery and stores would arrive. In truth, there were very little Turks facing him, and a golden opportunity to capture the high ground was lost. Hamilton urged Stafford to move on. When he did, it was 24 hours too late, as the Turks were now in secure positions. Clearly unfit to command, Stafford was dismissed on the 15th of August. He had just been 9 days in charge, and 9 days of disaster. In the following days, desperate battles took place at enormous cost. The failure of the battles of the 27th to the 29th of August marked the end of any more attempts really to advance at Sullivan. The opposing forces in Gallipoli had fought themselves to a standstill, and after suffering and inflicting huge losses on both sides, by October it was clear that much sought after breakthrough from the Sullivan offensive had failed, and Kitchener dismissed Hamilton. He was replaced by Sir Charles Monro. Monro was always maintained that the war would be won or lost on the Western Front, and he visited all three beachheads in one day and advised a withdrawal. Churchill caustically responded, he came, he saw, he capitulated. Kitchener was unhappy with Monro's recommendations, so he visited Gallipoli to see for himself. So he proposed the evacuation from Anzac and Sullivan, but to hold on to Hell, very quick peninsula. And that's Kitchener strolling around there. In November, while the politicians dithered on what to do next, the weather changed, rain flooded the trenches, followed by snow and freezing temperatures, and at least 200 died at Sullivan, frozen or drowned. On December the 8th, the order finally came from London to evacuate troops from Anzac and Sullivan, but retain Hells for naval purposes. Weeks before, Monro had got his staff together, both at Sullivan and Anzac, and asked for schemes on how to evacuate. They had to get 80,000 men, 5,000 animals, 2,000 vehicles, and 200 guns from 2 battlefields. There was a danger because there was so little distance between the front lines and the beach that the men would be caught in the open and slaughtered. They had to evacuate at night over a period of 10 days and unknown to the Turks, so that when the sun came up the following morning, everything looked the same as the day before. The evacuation was kept a secret from the troops for as long as possible, informing the troops that the garrison was being reduced to facilitate supply over winter. Firstly, they changed their routine so as to include 2 quiet days with activity every third day. Suspicious of this, the Turks discovered after probing the lines during those quiet days that the Allies were still there. So that would, when it would actually then be quiet, they would be actually on the move, and that sort of would give them that so much time. So the supplies were brought offshore each day. They were actually empty boxes that they brought ashore, and they piled them high, and it looked like they were stocking up maybe for the winter and that, but it was blocking off their view, and they were moving off, not moving on. So moving off equipment and not moving on. And it was a very clever thing to do. So they were storing empty boxes and then putting the equipment actually into the ships then as well. So the evacuation began on the night of December 10th. Each evening, a flotilla of small boats and barges crept into the Anzac and Sullivan piers, initially removing artillery, machinery guns, vehicles and ammunition, and then the following night 400 horses and mules. Then, in successive nights, the troops began departing. The men walked silently down through the trenches, their boots wrapped in sacking and layers of blankets laid along the piers. They timed how long it took. A trail of flour or salt was laid through the trenches for the men to follow in the dark. In the morning, the fleet had vanished and all appeared normal. By December 18th, all 80,000 troops had been spirited away with virtually no casualties. Before leaving, they had tunnelled under the Turks' trench and planted a ton of explosives and detonated it with an hour delayed fuse. They also had these rifles set up there with water cans, and the water would be dripping out of the top can down into the bottom one, and then pull the trigger so that the Turks would still think that they were there. The War Cabinet eventually agreed to evacuate Hells on December 27th. Could they now outwit the Turks a second time and evacuate 35,000 more troops? They used much the same plan which had worked at Anzac and Sullivan. Once again, half the garrison was evacuated secretly over a series of nights, and by January 7th they were down to 19,000. It was then that the Turks attacked. The attacks was half-hearted and over by nightfall. Before departing, they shot all the animals and prepared the stores for destruction. The last men had a 3-mile march to the waiting ships. The Gallipoli campaign lasted 260 days, in which over 4,000 Irishmen lost their lives, and it achieved absolutely nothing. The same amount of planning went into the landing as the evacuation. The outcome may have been different. So was the Gallipoli campaign really a lost opportunity to shorten the war? The Allies began the attack on Turkey with the belief that the country was second-rate and a pushover. So if the Navy just forced their way through the Dardanelles and threatened Constantinople, the country would just capitulate. It was never made clear how this would happen. How could ships take and hold an area of ground? The idea of purely naval operation was gradually dropped, and the Allies kind of drifted into this military campaign. The truth was, Germany would never be defeated by an ill-conceived adventure against Turkey. I've just had some Kinsale men that were actually killed in Gallipoli were Timothy Keating and John Murray. They were both killed on the landings on B Beach on the 25th of April. Robert Arnott with John Mahoney, Daniel Collins, Patrick Regan. They were all aboard the HMS Gallipoli, which was torpedoed and sank. John Grady and E.C. Yarmouth both killed in the infamous May the 1st attack. John Burchell was on board HMS Majestic and was torpedoed off Cape Hell. Michael Murphy was listed as a gunner on the 10th Heavy Battery Royal Garrison Artillery, died of wounds received in Gallipoli, and Lieutenant Fowler was killed in action on June 4th during the last attempt to capture the village of Pretty. So my grandfather, when I was looking up my great-grandfather's records, he enlisted on the 26th of October. Now, on the 26th of October 1914, the first hospital ship, called the Oxfordshire, returned from the Western Front, and it landed at Queenstown, and transferred 700 patients by rail to arrive at Glanmire Station, and from there to transfer to various hospitals. And these are, the photograph there is transport waiting in the station to take it off. So there was so much interest in that, so there was actually hundreds of people who came down to the Glanmire Station to witness all this, and they were all cheering the soldiers that they came and they were taken off and that. And that was the same day then that John Sullivan went up to the Victoria Barracks and he signed up. So I thought then that he'd got caught up in the euphoria, the whole thing. But when I eventually did find his records, he had actually served. He had 10 years before that, from 1902 to 1914, in the Royal Irish Rifles. I didn't know anything about that really. So it wasn't just a spur of the moment thing that he went up there on that particular day, but he signed up there. So he would have, when John Sullivan signed up, he would have expected to go to the Western Front. However, he was posted to the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force on about the 19th of May as part of a small group of reinforcements to the 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers. So he enlisted into the Royal Dublin Fusiliers of Collins Barracks, Victoria Barracks that day. So he was not part of the original landing, so he was killed by the Turks on the cliffs, which we were always taught. So he died actually on the 20. He took part in this Battle of Gully Ravine on the 28th of June. Now, on the 28th of June, they were expecting the 6th of August landing to take place in Sullivan at that stage. So there was no real need to be, to make any kind of advance. But I think Hunter Winston just wanted to straighten up the line at this stage, so that battle took place there. After which, said, I know that the day, because I looked at the diary, said that the day was a roasting hot day. The battle started at 11 o'clock that day, where they were told to blow the whistle and up over the edge. And he was reported wounded and missing. So he has no grave. So his name was recorded in the World War I monument in the South Mile there, that one there. And it's also recorded on the Hell's Memorial, the missing, along with 21,000 others recorded there that they have no known graves. So that after when the war was over, before the war was over, and arms was signed, the Turks came in and they cleared the battleground of all their own soldiers, and they buried them in communal graves. And but the Allies then they came in and they set up. There's a number of cemeteries all around Gallipoli there. Wherever they died, where there was groups of them died, they created a cemetery there. So that's the one on B Beach there. You can see there, that's B Beach down today. So there's lots of still things to see in Gallipoli, of the guns that are still there and that, stuff like that. And there's a well there. And you remember the Bouvet that we mentioned earlier, and that's the ship that actually went out on that night to put down the mines that the Allies didn't know anything about, and the Bouvet and stuff. So that ship is still there. And the cove now. There we go. And the dead man's penny. And any soldier that died for working one of those fled the topic. He died for freedom. There you go. The River Clyde ship, that didn't survive. It survived the war, but it was broken up much later, which was a pity really that didn't hold on to the ship.